In a moment that left the entire audience speechless, Karoline Leavitt stood her ground and delivered a comeback so sharp it completely flipped the conversation. Jasmine Crockett came in swinging, aiming to dominate. But what happened next was a powerful reminder that truth and conviction still matter on live TV. This wasn't just political theater, it was a real clash of values, and Leavitt's response struck a chord with millions of Americans who are tired of the noise and hungry for honesty. If you've lived long enough to see politics change, this exchange might just give you hope that real leadership is still possible. Before we dive into this unforgettable moment, let us know where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that cuts through the spin and honors what really matters. The stage was set for the American Forum, a primetime broadcast known for its political firestorms. But this night, it had the makings of something deeper, something decisive. Two women were seated beneath the glowing lights. On one side, Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman from Texas, smart, sharp, and hungry to score a viral moment. She walked out with fire in her eyes and a look that said, "I came to win." But across from her, Karoline Leavitt, just 27, press secretary, wife, mother, and the youngest voice to ever stand behind the White House podium. She didn't enter with swagger, she entered with purpose. A simple gold cross around her neck, a soft American flag pin on her lapel. No dramatic walk, no smirk, just focus. She wasn't there for Twitter clips. She was there for us, the people who remember what leadership used to look like. The audience was split. MAGA hats on one side, progressive t-shirts on the other. In between, veterans, truck drivers, farmers, grandmothers, single dads. People who had seen too many broken promises to believe just anyone. Marcus Steele, the show's veteran host, stood center stage like a referee before a heavyweight fight. "Tonight," he said, "we bring you the voices of two generations, two visions, two realities of what America is and what it should be." He paused, scanning the room. "Congresswoman Crockett, Press Secretary Leavitt, let's begin." And just like that, the air tightened. Every camera turned. Every heart leaned forward. This wasn't just going to be a clash of talking points. It was going to be a test of truth. Jasmine smiled first, wide, practiced. "Karoline," she said, her tone honeyed but sharp. "You're young, I'll give you that. And you've got energy. But do you really understand what it means to stand behind someone like Donald Trump? You're a new mother, a Gen Z woman, and yet here you are defending economic policies that have raised prices and hurt working families. That doesn't seem very pro-woman, does it?" A few gasps, nervous laughs. The jab was subtle, but clear. It was meant to rattle her. Karoline looked up. No flinch, no twitch. She just smiled, not the kind of smile meant for show, the kind that said, "I was ready for this." "Congresswoman," Karoline began calmly, "you're right, I am young, and I am a new mother." She paused, just enough to let the room settle. "Which is exactly why I'm here, because while you're in Washington reading headlines, I'm holding the hands of Americans who can't afford eggs and insulin in the same week. And you want to know what they tell me?" She looked out across the crowd, eyes meeting those of a silver-haired veteran in the second row, a single mom cradling a toddler in the third. "Thank God for Trump. At least someone's fighting for us." Boom! The room stirred, a ripple of applause. Then more. Jasmine Crockett leaned back, blinking. Karoline didn't blink once. "You ask how I justify tariffs," she continued. "How about 10,000 factory jobs brought back under Trump? How about farmers who finally stopped losing their land because we stopped letting China steal their future?" She tilted her head, voice unwavering. "You say I'm too young to understand. Maybe it's time Washington stopped acting too old to listen. The room erupted, applause, cheers, phones raised high in the air. One man shouted, "That's my press secretary." Jasmine's lips parted like she had something ready, but nothing came out. Not yet, because Caroline leaned in one last time. "I didn't come here to argue. I came here to remind America of what it already knows. Our country doesn't need style right now. It needs substance." She sat back, calm, steady, like a storm that had already passed. The crowd was on its feet, and Jasmine, she looked stunned. And we were just getting started. The cheers had barely faded when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her smile tight, her tone sharper now. "That's a cute speech, Caroline," she said, her voice dipped in sarcasm. "But let's get serious. Tariffs didn't protect American workers. They hurt them. Farmers lost overseas markets. Prices went up. You're young. You should know better than to parrot talking points from a man who divides more than he builds." A few people in the crowd clapped. Not many. Mostly the progressive corner. But the MAGA side stayed still, focused, waiting. Caroline didn't move, didn't blink. She simply folded her hands and spoke like someone who wasn't performing, but reporting. "Congresswoman, I don't need to parrot anything. I've looked those farmers in the eye. I've visited steel plants in Pennsylvania, where fathers and sons are working side by side again, because President Trump stood up to countries that dumped cheap metal into our economy and destroyed American pride. You say prices went up. What good is a cheap product if it costs us our future?" The room murmured. Heads turned. Someone near the back shouted, "Amen!" Crockett cut in. "But working families were hit hardest. You know that. The data's public. Tariffs hurt the poor more than anyone else. You're defending policies that made grocery bills skyrocket. Is that the America First you're talking about?" Caroline nodded slowly, as if weighing every word. Then came her reply, firm but without venom. "You want to talk about the poor?" she asked. "Let's talk about the single mom I met in Iowa who told me she finally got a manufacturing job after being on food stamps for 4 years under your policies. Let's talk about the grandmother in Ohio who cried when her grandson came home from his first week of work at a reopened factory. I don't need numbers on a screen. I have names, faces, stories. You want to talk about pain, Congresswoman? I've held it in my arms." The audience fell silent. No one dared interrupt. Even Crockett blinked, caught off guard. Caroline pressed forward, calm as ever. "You keep calling me young like it's an insult. But maybe youth is what this town needs. Because I don't carry 20 years of empty speeches. I carry today's burden. And I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to be clear." Boom, applause, loud, raw. Even some in Crockett's section clapped reluctantly. Jasmine's face hardened. Her voice rose. "You're clever with words, I'll give you that. But let's stop sugarcoating Trump's record. He cut taxes for the rich, ignored the poor, and you," she pointed now, voice trembling slightly, "you've become his mouthpiece, spinning half-truths, TikTok videos, headlines, while I've been in Congress fighting for minimum wage laws, for union protections, for the real backbone of this country." Caroline sat still. Then slowly she stood. Not to shout, but to be seen, fully. "Congresswoman, if you want to talk about being a voice, then let's talk about who's listening. Because while you're in Washington posting speeches, I'm in battleground states talking to people who say, we don't feel safe, we don't feel heard, and we're done being polite about it. Trump didn't abandon them, you did. And no TikTok post of mine has ever hurt the working class. But your silence on border chaos, your silence on fentanyl deaths, that's left entire towns shattered. The applause that followed wasn't just loud, it was thunder. Marcus Steele tried to regain control. "Let's remember, we're here for civil discourse," he said, glancing nervously toward Crockett. But Jasmine didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, her voice wasn't ready. She stared at Karoline, and Karoline, she didn't return the stare. She just turned to the audience, eyes scanning the veterans, the parents, the tired workers sitting on the edge of their seats. "We're not in a studio tonight," she said. "We're in a courtroom, and the jury is the American people." Boom! The crowd stood. Phones shot into the air. Crockett tried to find her next line, but by then, the tide had already turned. The crowd was still buzzing from Karoline's last line. "We're in a courtroom, and the jury is the American people." Jasmine Crockett tried to shake it off. She straightened her shoulders, flashed a tight smile, and leaned back toward her mic. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice rising slightly. "This isn't about data. This is about voices. Voices that have been silenced for too long. I stand here today not just as a congresswoman, but as a Black woman, a gay woman, a daughter of immigrants. And yes, that matters." There were polite claps from her side of the room, a few supportive nods. "Because people like me," she continued, "haven't always had a seat at this table. And when we do, people like you, Karoline, try to discredit us, not for what we say, but for who we are." Her voice was sharper now. "You talk about strength. I've had to be strong every step of the way. And when I see you defend a man who mocks women, insults immigrants, and builds walls instead of bridges, I have to ask, do you even know what it's like to feel marginalized?" A beat of silence. Crockett looked satisfied, like she had delivered a blow, but Karoline didn't move. Not at first. She just looked at her with a calm that unnerved everyone. Then she stood quietly and stepped forward toward her mic. "Congresswoman," she began, her voice soft but unshakably clear, "let me tell you what I know. I know what it's like to be doubted. I know what it's like to be underestimated, because I'm young, because I'm a woman, because I chose to be a mother while stepping into public service. But what I will never do is hide behind identity when I failed to deliver." The room froze. Even the host, Marcus Steele, didn't say a word. "You're right," Karoline continued. "Representation does matter, but only when it's tied to responsibility. Because being Black, gay, or female doesn't excuse incompetence, and it doesn't answer the mother in New Hampshire whose son overdosed because your administration ignored the southern border. It doesn't answer the steel worker in Ohio who lost his pension because Washington passed the buck. And it doesn't answer the grandfather in Texas who locks his door every night because cartel violence has bled into his neighborhood." Karoline stepped even closer to the mic. The room was silent, tense. "This is not about who you are. It's about what you've done. Or haven't." A slow gasp came from the audience. The kind of sound you hear when someone's heart drops. Crockett blinked. Her lips moved slightly, but no words followed. Karoline kept going, gently but firmly. "You say I can't understand what it's like to be marginalized. But I do. Not because of race or gender, but because I speak for people no one in Washington wants to hear from anymore. For the 70-year-old Vietnam veteran whose home sits across from a cartel smuggling route. For the widow whose husband died waiting for border security that never came. For the mother who buries her child and asks why no one in the White House ever showed up." Then Karoline looked directly at Jasmine, not with anger, but with something more powerful, resolve. "You say I silence voices like yours, but Congresswoman, it's your silence on the border, on inflation, on fentanyl, that has cost lives. You fight for your story, I fight for theirs." And then came the line, the one that would light up phones, headlines, and dinner tables across the country. "America doesn't need more representation at the microphone. It needs more responsibility behind it." Boom! The crowd didn't cheer right away. It was too stunned. And then, like thunder, applause roared through the studio. People stood. Some shouted. Others simply nodded. Deeply, quietly, like they just heard something they'd been waiting years to say themselves. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. She stared at her notes. She shifted in her seat. And Karoline? She sat down, slowly, with the kind of peace that only truth delivers. She hadn't attacked. She hadn't mocked. She had simply spoken for those no one else had the courage to represent. And everyone in that room knew it. You could feel it. Something had shifted, not in the lighting, not in the sound, but in the air. Jasmine Crockett sat stiffly, her knuckles white around the pen in her hand. Her voice, once so sharp and unwavering, now carried a quiver. Not of fear, but of realization. She had just been met with something Washington rarely offers anymore: unapologetic truth, and it showed. "Karoline," she started, her voice higher than before, "you don't get to stand there and talk about responsibility like you're above it all." Her tone trembled. "You're defending a man who's been indicted, a man who said horrible things about women, about people like me, and you stand there in your pretty little suit acting like that doesn't matter?" A hush swept through the room. Some gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. Karoline sat still. No flinch, no movement. Crockett pressed on, voice cracking now. "I've fought for healthcare, for education, for the people you say you speak for. While you tweet videos and wave numbers, I'm in the trenches, writing bills, pushing back, trying to hold a line." Her hand slammed the desk. "And all you do is polish Trump's image and pretend that makes you noble." The room was still. Host Marcus Steele leaned forward slightly, unsure whether to intervene. Karoline took a breath and stood. Her tone didn't rise. Her pace didn't rush. If anything, she got quieter, which somehow made it all the more devastating. "Congresswoman," she said softly, "I don't need a podium to know what fighting looks like. I've stood in communities where you promised hope, but left chaos. I've met with families whose kids were lost to fentanyl because your party turned the southern border into a welcome mat for cartels. I've spoken with workers who had to choose between paying rent or filling up their gas tanks." She stepped forward, not to dominate, but to draw nearer. "You say I polish Trump's image. No, I tell the truth about what he did, because no one else in your party will. Under Trump, unemployment dropped to historic lows. Prescription drug prices fell by 20%. ISIS leadership was crippled, and 6 American hostages were brought home." Her voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "You can slam your hand on this desk, you can shout, you can cry, but none of that changes the fact that while your party drafted speeches, I delivered answers." Jasmine blinked hard. Her lip trembled. Karoline took one last step forward. "You're right. I wear a suit, but I've also worn grief. I've sat with a woman who buried her husband because no one would secure their border town. I've heard a child say, 'Mommy cries every night now,' because their father lost his job and never came home again." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't talk to me about trenches, because I never left them." The room didn't erupt right away. It paused, just for a breath, and then applause, raw and rising, the kind that doesn't come from hype, but from conviction. Crockett sat still, blinking back tears. She looked down, lips pressed tight. And Karoline, she sat back down, not victorious, but steady, like a woman who didn't come for the fight, but stayed for the truth. Host Marcus Steele slowly turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've moderated debates for over a decade, but I've never seen anything quite like this. Tonight wasn't noise, it wasn't spin. It was something we don't see much of anymore: accountability. Jasmine Crockett reached for her water, but her hands shook, and the cameras were still rolling. The studio had gone quiet, not because the cameras stopped rolling, but because the room had run out of breath. Jasmine Crockett sat still, not defiant, not even defensive, just silent. She stared at the floor. Her hands, once gripping a pen with purpose, now trembled lightly in her lap. Her prepared talking points were forgotten, buried somewhere under the weight of what had just happened. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt, composed, calm, unbothered. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't basking. She looked like someone who had just done the job she came to do. No more, no less. Host Marcus Steele adjusted his tie and leaned into the mic. Congresswoman Crockett, before we close, is there anything else you'd like to say? A pause, longer than anyone expected. Finally, Jasmine leaned toward the mic and whispered the phrase that would haunt headlines for days. I don't have anything else to say. There it was, the phrase she had once used to dodge questions, now used to surrender. It didn't sound like strategy anymore. It sounded like resignation. Marcus turned to Karoline, his voice lower, more reverent now. Ms. Leavitt, closing thoughts? Karoline didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She just folded her hands on the desk and looked straight into the camera, straight into the eyes of millions watching at home. Tonight wasn't about me, she said. It wasn't even about this debate. It was about the mother in Ohio who's watching this from her kitchen table, wondering if she'll be able to afford groceries next week. It was about the grandfather in Arizona, a veteran, who locks his doors every night, not because of paranoia, but because no one in Washington is protecting his neighborhood anymore. It was about every American who has waited too long for someone to stop making excuses and start telling the truth. The room was still. The audience, once divided by party signs and color-coded seating, now sat unified by something much older. Common sense. Karoline continued, You're told to pick between leaders who perform and leaders who deliver. But we don't need performers anymore. We need protectors. We need fighters. We need men and women who will speak plainly, act boldly, and never forget who they work for. Her voice grew softer, more intimate. I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here for the single dad in Georgia, the widow in Wisconsin, the farmer in Kansas. I'm here for those who can't afford to wait for someone to fumble through their notes. She paused, a quiet breath. Because this country doesn't need another title holder. It needs a truth teller. And then, finally, she stood, not to gloat, but to close. You saw it for yourself. This wasn't a debate. It was a mirror. And when it was held up, only one person on this stage had the courage to face what was reflected back. Silence, then a single clap, then another, and another, until the entire studio rose to its feet, standing ovation, loud, earnest, sustained, not for theatrics, but for truth. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, her face pale, her eyes damp. She reached for her water again, but never lifted it. She knew what had just happened. Everyone did. As the credits rolled, social media lit up like a forest fire. Our Karoline crushes, truth overtitles, Leavitt 2028 clips of Karoline's line, America doesn't need performers, it needs protectors, went viral within the hour. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Facebook Reels. On X, one user wrote, I'm 72 years old. I haven't seen this kind of clarity since Reagan. Another posted, she didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She just spoke for us. Even traditionally liberal outlets couldn't spin it away. CNN ran a segment called Karoline Leavitt's Moment. Even MSNBC reluctantly called her a rising voice to watch, whether you like her or not. Fox News? They called it what it was, a complete dismantling. A Gallup Snap poll taken hours after the debate showed an 18-point swing in Leavitt's favor, across party lines. And for seniors, those 60 and up, support jumped 22% overnight. And final words to the viewer. If you felt something watching this, something you haven't felt in a while, a sense that maybe, just maybe, like someone still speaks for you, you're not alone. Millions of Americans saw themselves in Karoline Leavitt, not because she yelled the loudest, but because she told the truth, quietly enough to be heard. So if you're tired of dodges, if you're tired of being told to sit down and shut up, then stand with us. Drop a comment below. What moment hit you hardest tonight? Share this video with someone who's still searching for clarity, and hit subscribe. Because this movement isn't just alive, it's rising. And Karoline, she's just getting started.